Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
I'm the head of research for App Annie. For those of you in the room, how many of you are familiar with App Annie? How many of you actually use App Annie's products? Excellent. That's kind of the response I was somewhat expecting. So I've been with App Annie for a number of months now, and for those of you that have seen many of our insights reports, it's my team that's ultimately responsible for developing a lot of the key research that takes a look and does deep dives into our data, and to really assess what are the key trends happening in the market, what's the activity happening across different categories, across different markets, across the different app stores, how's monetization changing and growing. And prior to joining App Annie, I was at IDC leading the consumer and mobile research teams there, as well as our digital media research. And so research is near and dear to my heart. Given Casual Connect and given the role of this particular sort of session and focusing on certain aspects of how to use data to make different kinds of business decisions, what I'm going to be talking to you about here over the next 20 minutes or so is to share with you what we have seen and heard both through our data, but also through customers in terms of how they ultimately help to, how data and information helps them make better decisions when developing and ultimately launching an app. I'm going to focus obviously on games given the nature of this conference, and I'll take time for questions at the end as well. But I think this is going to be a really good discussion. And really, again, like I said, it's how to use data to better inform those app launches and the app development so that they're ultimately more successful, less costly, more profitable, and all that good stuff. So let's jump right in terms of what are these key steps. So if you think about the overall app market, just to put some context around it, so we're talking over 2 billion smartphones from an install base standpoint. This is an incredibly conservative number. This year alone, we'll see probably more than 1.4 billion new smartphones ship into the market. Now, some of those are obviously upgrades and replacements, but many of these, especially because of the emerging growth that we are seeing and just the huge volume shift towards sub-$200 phones, this means more and more first-time smartphone buyers, which is great for expanding that total available market that you as developers and publishers can ultimately serve and reach. From the standpoint of when we talk about monetization, if we just look at the App Store, last year we saw roughly $24 billion paid back out through the App Store. So obviously consumers spent another 30% on top of that. So these are massive numbers. And when we get to the step 4 in terms of how to launch your app, we'll talk about monetization more. Obviously store monetization isn't the only lever, advertising obviously being a big one, and I'll touch on that as well. And then again, some context around the numbers. When you start talking about 6.8 billion apps that are tracked on these app stores. So massive amounts of data. We have I think 7 data scientists on staff as of today, so very well-respected profession indeed. So let's jump in. So what are these 5 steps? Let's start with identifying high-growth countries. So a lot of times when, and this is maybe for some of you that are either sort of moving into new genres or that are relatively new to actually bringing games to market, here are some key things to keep in mind. So when you think about going into new markets, it's really important to identify which geographies you want to go in and to do it sort of smart and cost effectively. So what does this mean? I think the logical place a lot of people initially take a look at is emerging markets. So if you think about emerging markets, and obviously to do, a lot of people that maybe aren't super familiar with what's happening in different countries, don't have a ton of access to various amounts of data, the normal place to start is let's look at BRIC, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China. And so when you start thinking about the level of smartphone penetration, India, we are seeing be probably by far the strongest single large market in terms of year-over-year growth as China slows, and China slowing is still, hundreds of millions of smartphones a year that it's buying, but nonetheless, India is this sort of next frontier, and we're seeing amazing growth in this market year over year. But if you start to look beyond that and think about not just smartphone penetration, even tablet penetration. So while tablet sales are not only slowing, but in most markets, major markets starting to decline, the install base is still growing, right? Because these devices have usability, well beyond a couple of years, especially when they're iOS versus Android based. And so when you start to take a look at, okay, so when we start thinking about emerging markets, okay, BRIC's an obvious place to go. The data I'm going to be showing you today is all indexed. So what does that mean? It means we're taking a specific data point the historical sort of day one that we're showing you of one of the various metrics, and you'll see on this slide it's just one set of metrics in terms of brick revenue, in terms of App Store revenue, indexed for last year at 100. And so that growth year over year we're seeing is 40% in these 4 markets, right? So big numbers. So that gives you some sense of, okay, emerging markets growing incredibly quickly from a revenue standpoint, but we have to go beyond that, right? And what does localization mean? And localization can be expensive, right? It can be a matter of translation. It's also how do you ultimately write your descriptions? There's a lot of work to ultimately be done. So you want to take a step further than that, right? So then you start to dig into individual countries. And this is where, again, having access to data that you can start to look through and compare, okay, let's look even within BRIC from one market to another. Here's an example specifically of looking at Russia. And so what you're looking at on this chart, again, indexed based on Google Play downloads at the May 2014 timeframe. And what you're seeing over this sort of 5-quarter period is what's happening on an index download basis and comparing iOS to Google Play. There's a lot of things to sort of bear in mind as we think about Russia, right? There's, from the standpoint of smartphones, there's strong growth. The economy's had a lot of challenges, to say the least, over the last year and a half or so. We've seen increases in iOS, prices and so forth because of the devaluation of the currency and so forth. But the fact of the matter is we see this relatively strong growth overall and specifically around Android. So now you start getting a sense for this market, let's say, and its growth, and specifically Android versus iOS. And this is an important factor, again, when you start thinking about it's not just which markets to go into, but how to think about, do you initially develop for iOS versus Android? So last point I want to make as we take a look at this sort of step one in optimizing specifically your data set from market to market is to not just look at, okay, which countries within specific geographies you're looking at, or to take a look at, let's say, Android versus iOS. The other important thing to do is, okay, now let's take a look at subcategories, right? Because not all games are created equal in a market. So in this particular example, one of the things that we've seen through our data is that if you look at specifically strategy games, they index incredibly strong relative to sort of the average gamer worldwide. So again, from that sort of looking at this overall revenue, you see essentially like a 3x level of activity around strategy games in Russia versus the global market. So if that's the kind of genre you're developing for, this is another way to think about, is this the market I prioritize over another? So let's take a next step. So analyzing usage. So we've talked about downloads a little bit. I shared a little bit on the revenue side. These are obviously really important metrics. We all know that ratings and rankings and so forth matter in terms of getting those downloads and revenues to where they need to be. But now once you've got a level of install base, or once you're starting to also do competitive analysis, because before you're launching, obviously you want to take a look at games that are similar and seeing where that performance lies, not just in terms of downloads and revenue, but where usage lies. So thinking about the number of sessions, the duration of sessions, the total session time, those kinds of metrics become really important to benchmark against when, prior to launching your app. So when we talk about identifying trends in game usage, there's some obvious things, right? So I mentioned already revenue and usage tells you a lot, but it's certainly not everything. And when you want to look at sort of those competitive dynamics, this is a really important aspect to take a deeper dive into. And so without that usage data, you're really starting to, you're making decisions on things that are maybe not truly reflective of the kinds of demographics you want to go after, or how people are using the app, or ways to maybe engage them more deeply than something that would be considered a competitive app. So let's take a look at an example. So if you look at a market like South Korea, so South Korea, and specifically looking at bucketing games into core versus casual games. And what you see in terms of this year-over-year comparison is an incredible growth, essentially 50% growth year-on-year in terms of core. So what does that mean, 50% use? This is in terms of monthly time spent on Android games, on the top 100 of these games. And so if you look at this in terms of that year-over-year compare, again, if you're developing a more casual game, doesn't mean that South Korea is off the market. It just means, obviously, it's much more ripe for core games. I'm going to get a little bit more into the subcategory thing in a second. But this is, I think, an example of where having real benchmark data to not only look at categories, but specific applications so that you can make those comparisons and inform decisions about not just where to launch, but how to even measure success going forward and set KPIs is really important when thinking about usage data. So if we take a deeper dive in terms of core, So again, you can obviously look at these subcategories of games. And so if you look at sort of the top sort of three aspects of the massively multiplayer online role-playing games, as an example, or the trading card games, et cetera, action role-playing games, these are the ones that we're seeing tremendous amount of usage. And so you come over again from an index standpoint, and I'm going to come down and not trip. So again, it's indexed in terms of specifically a single point in time. So if you look at the 23 core games we looked at, and then those three subcategories within core, you see that these much more action-oriented games and trading card games, are indexing at a much higher rate, both in terms of the number of sessions per game, but also in terms of the average duration. So again, these are the different kinds of usage metrics that you can take into account as you design and ultimately want to benchmark your own game's performance against. Obviously, you could take it a step further and then compare it to other markets, not just across subcategories. You can also think about it from the context in some of these metrics of comparing across, Android users versus iPhone users. Some of the data is comparable, some of the data not, but these are really important metrics, I think, to ultimately understand where your game is seeing traction and success, and maybe ways to think about how you can ultimately evolve and enhance games so that there's even, more gameplay happening. So once you've got this sort of nailed down and you've determined, okay, these are the key markets we want to initially launch into, or at least the ones that we believe we need to be successful in order to be successful with our game, and you've looked at what are those competitive benchmarks across both revenues, downloads, and usage, the next thing is to do that initial testing. So let's talk about soft launches. So how do you decide when and where to soft launch your app? So we know that the numbers are a lot large, right? And then you could start segmenting them in terms of iOS and Android. Some of this will also depend upon the kind of monetization, which I'll talk about in the next step of this. And some of this will also depend on, potentially what other IP you've already developed for other games potentially you can leverage. But as you've identified the markets to go into, and you have identified to some extent maybe even which operating system you're going to prioritize first, the next step is to start thinking about what are those key KPIs that you want to benchmark against. So whether it's a function of looking at the level of activity of your own games, does it fit that market? Does it fit that market relative to that particular subcategory and genre and so forth? And then beyond that, the important thing to then do is start to model out what's the long-term value of customers that you can ultimately model out so that you can have some level of predictability around what you can generate for revenue and ultimately profitability. So when we think about soft launching, there's a couple key elements to this. So one would be selecting that target territory. So if you know you want to go after Germany as an example, well, that's a highly dominant Android market, and so you may want to test in certain Eastern European markets. That'll be less costly to do that initial test. If you're going after certain Asian markets, you may want to test in Southeast Asian markets like Malaysia, or Taiwan's one where we're seeing a ton of activity, but also a lot of Android-specific activity as well. And so when you think about this initial phase of soft launching the app, obviously an important thing is you've done a bunch of modeling in terms of client-server testing, but how individuals actually engage with your app in the real world and how that ultimately tests your servers and sort of the game's overall success and experience is not always the same as what's modeled out, right? And this is why this initial soft launch is really important. And so, there's advantages depending on which your target market is to go after iOS first. When you start thinking about if it's about, monetizing primarily through in-app purchases versus being more sort of mixed and more reliant potentially on ad revenue, you might want to go Android in the latter case. If it's more about wanting to be able to iterate really fast, like every few days as you're soft launching in order to tweak and test each iteration of the game, Android makes a lot of sense, right? Because you can ultimately send up, update each version much more quickly and not have to wait for that approval the way you would with iOS. So there's a number of reasons when to think about, why you would start with one store over another. But in terms of that quick iteration when you're doing soft launch, which is really important, Android makes a ton of sense. And that's where you want to look at countries where, from a user acquisition standpoint, to start getting in the, a few hundred testers of your game, those initial testers, looking at some of those lower cost markets. Like I said, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, again, which ones have similar characteristics to the sort of the bigger mature markets you're going after to ultimately help generate a lot more of the revenue and profits once you go full scale. From a phase 2 standpoint, it's now taking it a step further, right? Now you want to start modeling out the long-term value of your customers. And so now when you start thinking about this, it's, again, making that decision between the two platforms. Most publishers, when they're relatively new, aren't going to be going after both iOS and Android overnight, right? It's a walk before you run. And so you want to look for those like markets that have comparable long-term value of customers. So it's not just about the category and the operating system and so forth being comparable from that emerging market to that mature market in order to have a cost-effective test, but also from the standpoint of looking at benchmarking what that long-term value looks like and modeling it similarly for that bigger target market you're ultimately going after. So take it a step further as you start to think about the channels and the budgeting around the soft launch. So when you start to think about that testing of that gamer's experience within your app, now all of a sudden you want to start bringing in hundreds of users, right? And so that initial soft launch, when you start getting in hundreds of users to really do more active testing, and especially as you start to go into maybe your sort of primary target market, you want to start thinking about, okay, if I use lower cost creative, if I use banners and interstitials, these are lower cost options in terms of customer acquisition, right? You just need to bring in several hundred. You want to start testing and looking at what's day 3 retention, right? What's day 10 retention, 14 retention, 30 retention? And the idea of that, maybe within those first 2 weeks, modeling out what's the long-term value that you can expect to monetize off of that game, off of your average customer over the course of, let's say, 90 days if it's a sort of mid-core game versus, for those that are developing more hardcore games, they're looking at modeling it out, probably more like 90 to 180 day type LTVs. But even there, you're modeling off of maybe 2 to 4 weeks worth of, data and soft launch users. Now, once you've sort of proven that out and you have a comfort level in terms of that monetization, the next thing is to obviously take it to that next level. And this is where you start to think about, if I want to acquire more and more users, what are those different avenues, right? And you start to think about whether it's really highly targeted advertisements, and this is where obviously Facebook can come in as a really great partner from that standpoint when you start to think about being able to target very specific demographics. It's going to cost you, but now you're at that level where you're ready to start pulling in a much more meaningful set of folks so that you could start to develop hopefully that small but really important group of whales, right? And then of course using video. So now video we've seen tends to actually not only convert gamers effectively, but also we tend to see those that are converted with video tend to stay, their use of the game over a period of time in terms of the retention and length of time tends to be greater than we see with obviously those that maybe accidentally clicked on more like a banner ad, right? So this is where you want to start thinking about spending a bit more money to pull in more of those once you're ready to launch broader and bigger. From the standpoint of budget, and you see some numbers there, I mean, again, that idea on that initial soft launch, you're looking at really confining that budget, right? A few $1,000s in order to do some of that initial testing and long-term valuation modeling out. When you start going into more broad-scale deployment, it's highly variable, right? But you got to expect to spend sort of low tens of thousands, and I think obviously bigger publishers are spending quite a bit more than that, frankly even more than 50,000. But there's a lot you can do within that sort of 10 to even 40K range. So when you start to think about, okay, so now we've gone through benchmarking what's happening in different geographies, benchmarking what's happening in downloads, what's happening in terms of revenue, usage, doing comparisons across maybe similar genres and competitors that we would sort of say our game emulates and so forth. The next step after sort of thinking through some of these sort of game design issues is to obviously consider how do we think about monetization. And so I already touched on sort of that $24 billion number last year in terms of dollars paid out to developers through the 2 big stores. But it's obviously not just that, right? There's advertising revenue. And this is obviously incredibly important, especially on a global basis. So what you're looking at on this chart is across a select number of geographies, and they're listed there in the bullets. What you're seeing is the growth rate year over year of monetization through store versus through advertising. And the rates are quite comparable, and the overall volume of dollars is quite comparable. You're looking in that sort of mid to upper 20 billions of dollars a year. That number is obviously growing this year. We continue to see really strong growth overall in terms of monetization. And freemium has really been where the market shifted over the last several years. Games led the way. Other apps in some instances are following suit. But freemium has obviously proven to be the model that has resonated. And whether it's some upfront, but it's really about those microtransactions that happen throughout that consumer's interaction with that game in this case. But this is a really important aspect in terms of thinking about what's that what's the right way to model out not just the long-term value of your customers, but how are you ultimately going to capture that revenue? And so if you look at it from a market-by-market basis, what you see on this slide is similar to that last slide in terms of the mix that we saw last year in terms of revenue generated through the 2 major app stores versus in-app advertising. This is part of our app monetization report that we release at the beginning of each year, and this work is done in partnership and was the last 2 years between App Annie and IDC. And so what you see here is this general mix, and it's obviously a very wide range. Now these are all apps, these are not just games. I think if you were to look just at games, you would see it more weighted in mature markets towards in-app purchases and store-based revenue. So again, this is meant to sort of show the overall app monetization mix, and if it's games, you're going to see it's even more heavily weighted to in-app purchases. So step 5. So now that you've sort of launched your app, you're in your target markets, you've modeled out your long-term value, you're sort of on a good roll with a game, now what? That notion of expanding intelligently. Well, beyond expanding into new markets, which is a logical one with the same game and doing some localization, the next step is, well, how do you go even beyond that, right? And so you start to think about 2 key aspects here. One is reskinning your hit. So this is something that we've seen, Clash of Clans, Boom Beach is probably the quintessential example here in terms of reskinning. And it's not something that is unique to just games. We see a lot of other app categories, an example here around fitness, where it's like you've been doing something within a category of, let's say, running, and you apply it to biking, or you're doing something for running and you apply it to yoga and so forth. So what are ways to really take advantage of your IP in terms of your intellectual property of the development that you've done, and by reskinning it, can you frankly not only get it to market much faster, right? Maybe it's 3 months of development versus 6 to 9 months if you're starting from scratch. But it's obviously something that you can probably also do a better job of modeling out what the profitability is, because the general gameplay, the types of gamers you're going to be appealing to are going to look almost exactly like the ones that have been playing the previous version of the game. The other thing is to consider, not just the reskinning, which can be sort of taking, using sort of that same game engine and a lot of the programming you've already done and putting new art around it, but specifically around using IP. And this is something that we've seen a lot of the big publishers increasingly do, where there's an opportunity to not only use a lot of the existing development work you've already done, but does IP make sense for your business? And when you start to think about licensing intellectual property of another firm, now all of a sudden it's like, okay, there's a certain, how many millions of dollars up front are you willing to commit? And then, of course, the royalty share. And this is something that has to be modeled out, but we've seen, especially as publishers get bigger and bigger, something that's really been, I think, a sort of a crucial component for expanding upon and building upon the overall profitability of that initial work done on game development. And so, I guess in the final thoughts with this as I wrap up and start taking a few moments for questions is, whether you look at sort of some examples of those that have already sort of, walked the walk and talked the talk, the fact of the matter is in each of these cases, it is ultimately about being data-driven. And so whether it's a function of knowing exactly in your own apps what's sort of more engaging versus where you're losing your gamers, or whether it's more of a function of having better benchmarks to understand what that measurement of success should be, in terms of setting the right KPIs so that when you do those soft launches, you learn faster and with less expense, so that you can ultimately scale much faster and have a lot more profitability. And so, I think the message I want to leave you with is it's ultimately about being data-driven. And so with that, I will thank you for your time.
Awesome, thank you. We've time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. Well, no, maybe I'll start some questions. You have your finger on the pulse on a huge amount of data. Are you seeing any movement in emerging technologies, smartwatches, sort of VR? If you were doing this presentation this time next year, do you have any predictions for sort of what percentage of purchases or transactions are going to be done on smartwatches or on VR devices?
For games or in general?
For games. Okay. This is a gaming conference.
For games, I think it's going to take a lot longer to really figure it out in a more meaningful way. I think it's about, because of the form factor of the device, I think it's more about augmenting the experience and keeping you engaged as opposed to it becoming a primary device. Virtual reality, I think is a whole different ball of wax. And I think, when you start taking constructs from what's happened in console and more hardcore gamers and those kinds of platforms and having a much more immersive experience, I'm a huge believer in the fact that games will drive that market for years before we see it applied anywhere besides, let's say, vertical markets.
And if people want to talk to you afterwards, do you have a booth here, or how can they get hold of you?
We do. So App Annie has a booth. What's the number? Do you know? 106. Come over to 106. Happy to talk. We're also like 4 blocks away in the city. My contact information, so D. Levitas, you can find me on Twitter, but my email, dlevitas@AppAnnie. But yeah, there's a bunch of us roaming the floors here, and so we'd be happy to sync up and answer any questions you have after.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome job. Thank you.
Take care.